Hello, everyone. My name is Esther Miriam Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. Welcome to our webinar today, which is entitled Becoming Being British Muslim, Building Identity Across the Divide. I can see by the names that are appearing in our attendees list that quite a few of you have already been attending our webinars in the last weeks. And I'm very happy to see you all back. Welcome back. But there are also quite a few people who haven't joined us before. So if you're not familiar with the Wolf Institute, we are a research institution focusing on religion and society. And we combine our research with public education, teaching, and policy work to foster understanding between people of different religious communities. We're very, very pleased today to have a very distinguished panel with us. Joining us as chair is Dr. Emmanuel Derlias-Posti from the Center of Islamic Studies here in Cambridge. Emmanuel's research focuses on British Muslims, particularly minority communities such as the 12 Shi'a community. The discussion today will be informed by her recent British Academy funded project entitled Beyond Sectarianism, which investigates intra-communal relations among Muslim communities in the UK. This is, of course, an ever incendiary and current topic, in particular between Sunni and Shi'a communities. Just in the last days, we've seen a controversy after a Twitter post was made pertaining to a shooting of a young woman. A man who posted this regretted raising funds for a murder victim after he realized she was Shia. So this led to an extended debate via social media, and the man apologized, but of course this reflects prevalent sentiments and stereotypes. We're also very pleased to virtually welcome our other two speakers today. The first is Sheikh Nur Mohammed of the Hikmah Foundation. Sheikh Nur is an Islamic scholar, speaker, and researcher, and the current Minister of Religion at the KSIMC of Birmingham. He also, and I'm very pleased to say that, he holds the position of the Lady Khadija Visiting Fellow in Shi'a Studies at the Wolf Institute, so he's been with us for the past few months. And our second speaker is Dilwar Hussain. Dilwar is a British academic and independent consultant working on social policy, Muslim identity, and Islam in the modern world. He's also the founding chair of New Horizons in British Islam, a charity that works on Muslim identity, integration, and reform, and a research fellow at the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations at the University of Coventry. Welcome to both of you, Dilwar and Nur.
Thank you, Dr. Maria.
We will begin the discussion with a short introduction by Emmanuel, which will then be followed by comments by the two speakers, and we will then open up the floor to Q&A. So your questions, please type them into the little chat, not in the chat box, but the Q&A box, because it will make it much easier for me to chair. We already have some chats here, people wishing us Eid Mubarak to all who celebrate, and then hello from Canada. So we have people tuned in from all over the world. And I'm now handing over to Emmanuel to start everything off. To you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Miriam. So first of all, I would like to thank Miriam and the Wolf Institute for hosting the webinar today, as well as our two distinguished guests for agreeing to participate in the discussion. So thank you very much to Sheikh Nuru and to Dilwar. As Miriam mentioned, the idea for this webinar came off the back of a research project I've been engaged in over the last year or so that has been seeking to investigate intra-Muslim relations in the UK, and in particular to move beyond problematic framings of internal antagonism as reducible to the rubric of sectarianism, which is all the more prevalent or pertinent today, I think, following the recent social media fallout that Miriam mentioned earlier regarding the death of Aya Hashim and sort of the things that have been thrown up as a result of that, and perhaps we can get to that in the discussion later. But while Muslim communities in Britain are arguably under greater scrutiny than ever, I would say there remains a dearth of understanding regarding issues of minority representation and diversity among Muslims from different branches of Islam, especially in Britain, where academic scholarship on British Islam tends to follow the majority, which tends to be sort of Sunni, Pakistani or South Asian origin, and there isn't really a huge amount of research that has been done on the internal diversity in Islam and how that is represented in the British Muslim sphere. So in the face of reported rising intercommunal antagonism, And against the background of obviously ongoing sectarian tension in the Middle East and wider Islamic world, there is certainly a pressing need for a more nuanced understanding of the Muslim community in the UK. So how can we go about beginning such conversations? My research just forms a very small part of this, and there are a huge number of very, very interesting projects that are happening at the grassroots level, and hopefully we can touch on that as well. But in my own work, I grapple with a lot of issues of identity and belonging, concepts that are once slippery, impossible to grasp, and seemingly deeply rooted and stable. They have this paradoxical quality. For example, one of the main themes to emerge from the Beyond Sectarianism project was the question of how to define British Muslim identity, especially when it comes to issues of diversity and tolerance, both within and without the Muslim community. If such a term even makes analytical and empirical sense, can we even speak of a British Muslim community? So I would like to start by addressing both of the panelists and asking them to engage with a question that is both complicated and simple. So what does it mean to be a British Muslim today? Is there more than one British Islam? And if so, does this internal diversity pose a problem? Perhaps Dilwar, you would like to begin.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Just like to say as well, thank you very much to yourself, Manuel, and also to the Wolf Institute for hosting us for this. And it's lovely to be with Sheikh Nuru and to share this virtual panel, if you like. I think you raised some very important and pertinent questions, and the very sad incident that you just flagged up, I think, is only emblematic of some of the really difficult issues that we're having to deal with right now. But they're nothing new. They've been, unfortunately, this sort of tension has been brewing and has been developing and emerging over the years. But let me go to the heart of the question that you asked in terms of British Muslims and identity and what does all that mean to us. I mean, so for me, as somebody who's working on this area and with the organization that I chair, as well as my research, the organization New Horizons in British Islam, one of the things that we try to look at is this whole question of how Islam evolves and emerges within diasporic contexts such as Britain. So, you know, this is of grave importance to us. For us, living in this country means that we, or any country, but obviously here we're talking about the context of the UK, it means giving serious attention to the context that we find ourselves in the UK. Because Islam can never, and historically has only ever been a set of values that takes root in a given society, in a given place, in a given time and context. And so if we take this very contextual approach to Islam, it means that we need to, you know, Islam is like a seed that you sow in a soil, and the makeup of the soil will influence the plant that grows. And what we're seeing now emerging is a Western, is a European vision of Islam that is emerging. It may take some time, but it is definitely something that we're seeing emerging. And I think 2 or 3 of the values that I think we therefore really need to seriously pay heed to are issues such as diversity and plurality, or fairness and equality. I'm almost saying these as pairs because they're related. And there are many others, but I want, in the light of what you've just mentioned, I want to emphasize just these 4 values. If we pay serious heed to these and think of our religion, of our faith as a spiritual tradition that emerges in the context of values such as this, I think this is what will help us to cut through the sectarianism that we're seeing, to reach beyond these sectarian boundaries. Because if we're taught that diversity is a good thing, that plurality is a good thing, if we're taught that we need to be fair, ethically, a priori, our religion is something that has a vision for equality and fairness of humanity, let alone Shia and Sunni, but all human beings, we need to see each other as equals and treat each other with fairness and dignity. So these are the values that we see not only within Islam, but also very important values within our European and our British landscape. And I think we need to pay special heed to those things. Unfortunately, what we have seen, and I'll finish by just saying this bit for now, what we have seen over decades now is the influence of brands of Islam, visions of Islam that run counter to what I'm trying to articulate here, often sponsored by countries. So it's not just some sort of organic Islam that's developing, but you see very black and white, very literalist and narrow visions of Islam that have been emerging and evolving, often pushed, as I say, by state sponsorship. And that, I think, has created over 20, 30, 40 years a narrow literalist mindset, a mindset that is deeply problematic, and one that often encourages Muslims to think in quite binary terms, in terms of us and them. And that's why I think you saw in this tweet when this person who sounded like he was trying to do the right thing, but when he withdrew his support for the fundraising campaign that he had initiated for this poor woman who was killed, he withdrew it on the basis of a sectarian affiliation. He withdrew it because he somehow didn't know that she was Shia, and when he found that out, he had to withdraw his money and his campaign. And he says, "Oh, because I don't want to fall into problems in the hereafter." He feared for his own soul that if he supported somebody who was Shia, he would go to hell. Now that has come from somewhere. It hasn't just originated in that person's mind out of nothing. Something has planted those sorts of seeds in this British landscape, and we need to eradicate those seeds and tackle them head on. I'll hand over to the Sheikh for now.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Emmanuel and Dr. Miriam, for organizing such a wonderful conversation. I think we definitely need such a conversation to look into the relationship between the Shias and Sunnis. And it's indeed a great pleasure for me to share this platform with Dilaver. What does it mean to me to be a British Muslim? That's the question. And I echo what Emmanuel said earlier on, that, it's simple and at the same time it's complex. From my personal opinion, I think to be a British Muslim, to me, it simply means an opportunity to practice my faith. Being here in this country provide me with the freedom to practice my faith. Yes, there are challenges out there, either out of ignorance or out of just mere hate and nothing else. And kindly allow me to look at this from the lens of glorious Quran. As Muslims, our guide is glorious Quran and the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. And of course, being a Shia, as you know, in addition to taking the traditions from Prophet Muhammad, we also look at the traditions of the household of Prophet Muhammad and some of his sincere and purified companions. If you go to Quran 49, verse 13, God Almighty, from my personal reflection, talks of identity in this particular verse of glorious Quran. It's a known verse, if not to all of us, to some of us who often engage in either intra-faith or interfaith dialogues, that God Almighty makes it very clear how he created male and female from a single substance. And from there, he made us into tribes and nations. To me, God is trying to highlight on the importance of celebrating diversity and being proud of one's identity. And if you really look at this verse from close, you realize that God Almighty is highlighting on different forms of identity. The first one is human identity. You are a human being, I'm a human being. That is our first identity. And the other identity, if you look at the verse, is tribal identity and national identity. And then the last part of the verse looks at religious identity. And so therefore, being a British Muslim comes with different identities. The first identity means what? British, living in this land. And the second identity is being a Muslim. But of course, being a Muslim here, I'm not looking at either Shia or Sunni. I'm looking at Muslim in general. Those who believe Allah is one and Prophet Muhammad is the last messenger of God. So British, Muslim, Islam invite us to be proud of who we are and to be proud of our identity. And yes, it's very sad, as Brother Dilwar beautifully mentioned, that there are those who tend to listen to others, who tend to allow others to take their freedom away from them by promoting hate, like in the case of our young, beautiful girl who lost her life a few days ago. A young man started fundraising, which was a good thing. But eventually, when he realized she was a Shia, he then stopped. But if you look at the trend, you realize that when he stopped, there were so many Sunnis out there who stood up and say, this is wrong. We are going to fundraise and build a mosque in the name of this girl. And so therefore, to be a British Muslim, to me, simply means what? An opportunity to practice my faith, bearing in mind the challenges that are there. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. I think those are very interesting responses, and you both touched on some similar issues. I think in particular, Dilwar, what you were saying in terms of the way in which there are alternative voices out there that are spreading this very polarized narrative, often coming from abroad. And I think the example that, the most recent example that we've been talking about is a very good exemplar of this, that you have, as you mentioned, the seed of an idea that has obviously been planted externally. And I suppose my question would be, what kind of practical measures can we actually implement to try and combat these narratives? And on the flip, sort of a related question is also then, well, who speaks for British Muslims? Because we are having this plurality of voices, but then the voices that become amplified tend to be the ones that are always the most extreme, and often not in a good way. And so how can we negotiate that problem, in that if you're trying to increase plurality, but then the plurality isn't being reflected, how can you increase the visibility of that plurality, I suppose?
If I go first, I think, yeah, these are good questions, and often I think without very easy answers to some of them, at least. I think the issue here is really education, because the way that the Muslim community has developed in this country, it's developed in a diaspora situation, and actually even not just in the diaspora, even in many parts of the Muslim world, where Islam has now become so much of an identity issue. I mean, I was writing in the 90s about Muslim identity, and actually over the last 10 years or so, I've begun to de-emphasize that work that I was doing, because at that time I was writing about the recognition of Muslim identity and so on. But I realized after 9/11 that Muslims had become so obsessed with identity and recognition and representation that I think I think the balance had tipped in the opposite direction. And Islam is now so much of an identity, it has become an identity before it is a spiritual religious phenomenon. So people know that they're Muslim, and they think that others are against them, and they think that they are victims, and they think that they have a problem with the state or a problem with this group or that group, before they fully and deeply understand the spiritual core and dimensions of the Islamic faith. The identity is often the issue, the entry into Islam, and often, and I think the journey is a positive one after that, a person then settles and develops a more spiritual awakening. And the problem associated with this is, if we primarily think of any religious phenomenon primarily in terms of identity, we're going to quickly lean towards an us and them dichotomous thinking. because not only is identity about who we are, identity is often about who we are not. And defining in-group and out-group becomes an essential part of identity formation. And so I think part of the problem here is that we have made Islam into so much of a identity that we wear on our sleeve. We've got to differentiate ourselves. I mean, I'm not advocating this, but this is the current narrative, that we've come to a place where we need to differentiate ourselves. And I think this is why we need to take a step back from all of this, go back to the core values and the core principles of Islam, which start with an appreciation of God, who is the creator of all, of everything in the universe, and start from there, develop our relationship with God, develop an intense sense of, knowing that God constantly describes the creator as Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most merciful, the most generous, or the most kind. Knowing that God has qualities such as, Al-Wadud, the loving. These attributes of God become almost pushed to the periphery in the race towards a political definition of Islam and a recognition of Islam that is laden with all of these contexts of these sentiments of victimhood and so on. And so we've got to reverse that. We've got to bring the spiritual core back to the center and work out from there. And I think that's where our journey has to begin. We have to bring about this sort of reawakening. And as I said, that's partly about education. We've got to take people back to almost first principles, and people have become disconnected with their religious tradition. So they know a lot about Islam superficially. They know that Islam, there are a lot of lists of do's and don'ts and things that you have to wear and things that you can't eat and so on. But beyond that, they're not thinking about the deeper values, the things that actually really make a Muslim. And the complex ways in which the Quran addresses people, all human beings. And actually the way, if you look at the narrative of the Quran embraces all humanity. So many of the verses of the Quran relate not just to Muslims, but to human beings. Ya ayyuhan nas is a very, very common call in the Quran. It addresses all human beings, and it tries to embrace them and invite them to think and reflect and do good and be a force of good in the world. And this idea of just seeing ourselves as victims takes us away from that. It takes us away from that into a domain where we see ourselves as downtrodden, underprivileged, even when we're not. I mean, anybody who lives in this country and has been to university or has had a decent education isn't underprivileged. Actually, they're very privileged in the context of the world around them. So rather than see that, we see victimhood. We see ourselves as being downtrodden. And we're just like that, giving away agency into nothingness and seeing ourselves as victims. And I think all of these are huge problematic elements. And obviously, the point is that when you do that, you look for other people, you look for someone to blame. Just as we see amongst when the far right tries to blame Muslims, it sees that there are things going wrong in society and it identifies Muslims as a scapegoat. Muslims are doing that as well. When they see things going wrong in their own circles, they identify groups, and then small groups, the minority groups, whether it's Shia groups, whether it's Ahmadiyya groups, whether it's other minorities, men against women, and so on and so forth. The in-group and the out-group, there's a power dynamic here, and the out-group often takes it out on the in-group and tries to blame them for whatever they see as the ills. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No problem. Thank you so much, Dilawar. I just want to begin by echoing what you said at the end. We don't have reasons to have this inferiority complex. We're all living in this land, and this land is guided by the constitution, by rules of law. And so you part and parcel of the development, nothing to shy away of being a Muslim. But then how do we go about it practically, as you ask Emmanuel? Number one, of course, is education. And education can come in different forms altogether. Like the way Dilawar mentioned, when you go to Quran, God Almighty invites us on numerous occasions to embrace and celebrate diversity. It's very, very important, because at the end of the day, and even Quran mentioned it also, not only from the sociological point of view, man by nature is social. You need to love and to be loved. You need to understand and to be understood. You need to reach out and to be reached out. And this has no boundary. It's not just about you and your Muslim community. So therefore, education is definitely key. We need to go back to drawing board in trying to understand what are the core values and the core teachings of Islam. And this reminds me of one of the beautiful teachings of Imam Ali alayhi salam. You know, Imam Ali beautifully, when he sent one of his governors to Egypt by the name Malik Ashtar, he gave him a long list of values that he was supposed to do. One of those values is that he said to him, "Oh Malik, when you get to Egypt, note that people are of two kinds. They are either your brothers in faith or your equals in creation." Some translate it, or your equals in humanity. That's the first principle of Islam, really. That's the first value that Islam teaches us. So we need education in the form of conversation like this. You know, this type of a conversation is very, very important. And I know there are those who tune in this afternoon because of the recent incidents, and they are looking forward to hearing something from both Shias and Sunnis. So we need education. People need to be constantly educated in the form of conversation like this. Number two, in the form of a seminar. We need more seminars. Invite different Islamic scholars from different schools of thought, Shi'i, Sunni. Invite them, have these kind of conversations, ask those difficult questions. And I think by so doing, we'll be able to unlock the true values and the true secrets of Islam, which will then make people cherish and understand. And another practical way is by writing articles. Really, reach out to Islamic scholars and ask them these type of questions. Let them write articles and share these articles with the wider communities for people to understand what Islam is all about. Your other question is as to who speaks for Muslims now within the British context. It's a very complex question, and I do not think there is a straightforward answer. What I can say is that, you know, when it comes to general political issues or general social matters such as Islamophobia, hate, so we have different organizations within the country that often stand and speak on behalf of Muslims, and the mainstream media normally reach out to them. A typical example is the Muslim Council of Britain, you know. So this Muslim Council of Britain, even my organization, is an affiliate member. And I think they have a lot of mosques and Islamic organizations who are affiliated with them. So they speak when it comes to general matters, but when it comes to complex theological and jurisprudential matters, no, each and every school of thought have those scholars that they rely on them. For instance, I can speak on behalf of the Shias or as a Shia, for instance. You know very well within the Shi'i school of thought, we still have this concept of ijtihad, that the door of struggling to determine Islamic law is still opened, it's not closed. So therefore, we do have great scholars that we always rely on them when things are confusing. And one thing that I've learned from my engagement with our great scholars when we are faced with challenges, especially with those who live here in the West, is that the first thing is what? Respect the rule of law wherever you live in. Don't go against the rule of law, even if it is against your Islamic value. Respect the rule of law. In other words, from our perspective, standing against the rule of law is tantamount to standing against God Almighty. So therefore, as to who speaks for Muslims, there are multiple people who speak for Muslims in this country, and it all depends on which school of thought one is affiliated with. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikh. I think that was, I wanted to actually pick up on the last thing that you mentioned. This, I think in some ways this is quite specific to the Shia tradition, but I think there are parallels with Sunni Islam as well. Obviously you have the Marja'iyya and the scholars who tend to be based actually in the Middle East and wider Islamic world. And there is, one of the things that's come out in my research is this discrepancy between, especially in the diasporic context, things that are happening at the grassroots, and the rulings of the scholars, whether they be Shia Maraja or whether they be, Sunni scholars elsewhere. And do we need more representation of British Muslim scholars that are engaging actively with the grassroots? So just to give you an example, I did some field work in Hausa in Mashhad, where I was traveling with a group of young British Shia, and we were attending the Hausa classes, and the scholar there we were talking about negus, and how he was telling the students that they should, especially in Britain, make sure not to eat food from a restaurant just in case it had been prepared by a Hindu, and they couldn't touch anything on public transport because it may have been touched by, and the students just looked at him and was like, well, we can't live like that. So there is this discrepancy between scholarship that is happening in a Muslim context and the real lives of British Muslims on the street who are engaging with much more diverse and plural societies. So how do you square that circle?
Yeah, so can I go first, Mr. Delewa? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we do have these challenges now and then, especially with the young British Shi'i Muslims. Our scholars from Middle East, of course, as you beautifully mentioned, Emmanuel, we refer to them as Maraji'. So Maraji is the plural of Marja', someone you refer to when it comes to your jurisprudential responsibility, if you like. Because when it comes to theological responsibility, it is upon a person to make his or her own research and to take a stand. So yes, sometimes we do come across some of the teachings and the fatwas of our Maraji, which if you look at it practically with what we do, it may not go well. Definitely, they try their level best to deduce these Islamic laws as per their understanding of the teachings of Quran and prophetic traditions and the traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Do we need British Maraja or Marja? Why not? Definitely we need, without a shadow of doubt. And I'm saying this not taking anything away from our great scholars, such as Ayatollah As-Sayyid Ali Sistani and the rest. No, we love them and they are our great scholars. But yes, we will need some to rise to the occasion and to be able to reach to that level of ijtihad. That will definitely make life much easier than as it is now. So therefore, we need to encourage one another, those who've got the potential and the capability to take their Islamic studies to the next level. Why not? And as I said earlier on, the door of ijtihad is wide open. It's not closed. And it is open to all, whoever has the potential to become mufti, as our Sunni brothers and sisters mentioned. Yeah.
Just add to that, and thank you very much. I think you're right in what you've just said, and also Emmanuel, the points that you raised, I think, are really pertinent points. I want to make, I think, maybe two points here. One is that I think Muslim scholarship, and I'm talking more about my Sunni experience here. I have visited Iran, and I was very impressed with the level of scholarship in the seminaries in Iran compared to what I've seen in Sunni context, actually. I think we're playing catch up. I think we're behind the game in terms of what's going on in the world. I think we have to be honest and accept that the level of scholarship in many of the seminaries, in many of the centers of learning, are not what they should be, and not where they were in the heydays of Islam or in the glory days of Islam, in comparative terms. And it's no accident then that people want to come to Western countries and study in universities like Cambridge and the other place, and so on and so forth. Because this is where the most exciting and cutting edge learning is taking place. I think that's just a statement of fact. And it's only when we can raise the levels of the education, the educational levels of institutions of learning in the Muslim world. And I would say, think long-term, develop those sorts of centers here in Western centers of, in America, in Europe. And when we have the likes of an Al-Azhar or Home or whatever, these sorts of seminaries operating here in Western countries, that we will see the long-term flourishing and actual deep-rooted contextualizing of Islam, because scholarship needs these free environments in which to operate and develop and deepen itself. You were talking earlier about British Muslim identity, and I mentioned, this contextual approach. I want to take that a little bit further and suggest there are at least two dimensions to this context we need to think about. One is the superficial, so how you dress and your mannerisms and the everyday culture and so on. But actually the deeper context is about the philosophy and the ideas of the traditions of a society, the values of a society. And it's only when we start interacting with that and contributing to that and taking from that, drinking from that, and adding to it, that we're actually going to make a long-lasting presence felt in countries like Britain. And this is not actually new. If you go back to the history of Islam, Islam spread very quickly from the Arabian Peninsula and encountered Greek learning, encountered learning from China, from India, from all the other places around it, and absorbed that learning. And it was because it absorbed that learning that it was able to then become a splendorous civilization. It didn't become a civilization in a vacuum. It took from all these other people, added to it, and annotated it, added their own contributions, and that's how Muslims were able to, and Arabs were able to springboard into a golden age of philosophy, science, mathematics, and so on. So if we were able to learn from Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, why can we now not learn from Kant and Hegel and the more contemporary philosophers? And there is a dichotomy here between Shias and Sunnis, because amongst the Sunnis there is this huge allergy now towards learning philosophy. I mean, thankfully Shia Usul has maintained this, and I think it's helped you. But amongst the Sunni world, there is almost a disdain in terms of studying philosophy within the madrasas. So people, when they study philosophy, they'll generally do it outside of their madrasa curriculum rather than it being a part of their madrasa education. So, and this has led to a fragmentation of knowledge, whereas Islam has always claimed that it is about the unification of knowledge rather than this sort of obsession of fragmentation. So these are some of the things we need to do. The second point I wanted to make is that actually on an everyday level, and that's I think where you were really asking, Emmanuel, people are getting on with their lives. The reality is that everyday people do what they need to do, and they do what they have to do, and often the scholarship will catch up with people and rubber stamp and validate what they're doing. You look at things like mortgages, things like the way that people relate to each other, the way that people have opened up far more in Western context in terms of attitudes towards gender differences, education, women going into work, and so on and so forth. Yes, it's true that for some people they have constantly looked towards fatwas and looked towards primarily the East for permission to do those things, but actually many people have just got on with those things, and as a result you see this very wide and actually quite creative and beautiful spectrum within Muslim practice, from very secular all the way to very hardline religious, and many different positions in between. And people are organically getting on with their lives because they know that that's what they have to do. Scholarship often then comes and says, oh yeah, that thing that you just did, it's okay. Or they might say it's not okay and risk not being listened to, except for a small cohort of people. So I think people have, thankfully, God has put in all human beings what we call the fitrah, this innate instinct. And I think that is also at play, because we believe that revelation is something that is constant in terms of, it isn't, you have the Quran as a revelation, but our fitrah and what we see in nature is also something that propels us to act, propels us to do. And that is also a very, very serious part of the Islamic teachings. It's not outside of the Islamic teachings. And our fitrah will pull us, direct us towards some of these solutions, even when our scholarship is lagging behind.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dilwa. I think some very, very interesting points that have been raised, and I think we have quite a few questions in the Q&A section. So I will allow Miriam to chair the Q&A section because she knows what she's doing, and I haven't done this before. So
I'm very happy to take this over. So we have a question from Ivan, and the question is about liberal Islam and anything that might be called secular Islam. Does this have a future in Britain? Is it a great threat to mainstream Muslim identities? So, yeah, basically he's asking, what do you think about liberal Islam in Britain?
Yeah, so let me begin. You know, liberal Islam in Britain, I don't know what he meant or he meant by liberal Islam. I personally believe Islam is a holistic way of life, and it provides us with general guiding principles on how to live our lives. And you know, Mr. Delawer made a very beautiful point when it comes to fitra, this innate instinct or primordial nature, as some may call. So therefore, I don't think there is a need for that in my own personal and humble opinion. I think Islam is flexible. It depends on one's circumstance and one's situation. It's not like fixated that if something is beyond your control, you must do it. No. And as I mentioned earlier on, as per our teachings from our great scholars and from our books, you know, when Islam clashes with the rule of law of your country, you have to go by the rule of law. You cannot stand against the rule of law. So, as I said, I'm proudly British Muslim. I practice my religion freely. I don't have any problem. I engage with people. And so, yeah, I think it's good. But definitely we'll need more scholars who will live with us here and who understand the situation. But otherwise, those scholars out there, they are also doing their best and they are playing their part, yeah.
Dillo, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think 2 points again. I think on the one hand, I think terms like liberal or progressive or secular, you know, they're quite loaded terms, and without having a long time to discuss them, we may not understand what we're actually talking about. So yeah, I mean, I think they have their place. They have their you know, everybody has a right to their views, but we can often get talk at cross purposes and not be in full agreement as to what each of these definitions means. Having said that, I'm all for a live and let live approach to these things, as I hope you can see. And I think that people will organically develop whatever form of Islam is appropriate to their needs and to their conditions and to their circumstances. And I think that's absolutely fine. I think the schema of Islam is a very broad schema. The pathway of Islam is very broad. And we have in the history of Islam a huge diversity of opinion within, and this is something that actually people mention, but they're actually not fully aware of the exact precise breadth of how far wide these diverse opinions ranged, even on something like prayer or fasting or dress or food and so on and so forth. So there's such plurality within the traditions of Islam, within the history of Islam, that you can see within that opinions that are liberal, opinions that are more hardline, and so on. And I think that's only going to happen in the future. That's only going to be replicated in the future. We live in an environment that tends to be more progressive and more liberal than other parts of the world. So I guess in a way that will favor, that will you know, when Islam is like water that we're pouring into a vessel, and it will to some extent replicate the vessel that it's being poured into. It will take on the color and the shape of the vessel. And so I think we're going to see a reflection of Islam that fits within the environment of this country.
Thank you. We have a question from Charles in Ghana. And how can Muslims bridge their internal boundaries, not from a theological perspective, but from the perspective of understanding and tolerating the religious other? So, how would you pragmatically go about bridging between the communities?
Yeah, so I think in the past years, or maybe I should say ever since the 9/11 happened, we've seen a lot of interfaith programs, interfaith dialogues, and we've seen people taking a lot of interest in bridging gaps with people of different faiths or different religious affiliation. You know, as I said, there are so many narratives out there, but if you really go back to the glorious Quran, and if you examine the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, you realize that Prophet reached out to people from different background, from different walks of life. A typical example, when the Holy Prophet migrated from the holy city of Mecca to the holy city of Medina, you know, one of the things that Prophet did was to administer the drafting of the constitution of the holy city of Medina. You know, Medina Bill, some call it. If you Google, you will find it there. And in that constitution, there is a clause which is very clear when it comes to the relationship between Muslims and Christians and Jewish, because they were then the three main religions. Clearly stated that Muslims should not harm a Christian and vice versa. It should not harm a Jewish. You know, we should join our hands together. We should work together and let everyone practice his or her own faith. So therefore, I personally believe as a Muslim, Islam and its teachings are universal. Just that, unfortunately, as Brother Delaware mentioned earlier on, there are people who just listen blindly and think of representing Islam, whereas they know nothing about Islam. So in terms of bridging gaps, that's what we are doing. This program that we are having tonight is not only conversation between me and Mr. Delaware, but we've got Dr. Miriam here, you've got Emmanuel here, we are also with Wolf Institute. This all in the spirit of what we learned from Islam to be able to bridge gaps. And our great scholars from both Sunni and Shia, but I can speak more from the Shia perspective, encourage us to deepening our interfaith or interreligious dialogue for the purpose of bridging the gaps that are available or created by ignorance. And so therefore, yes, I'm very much hopeful, and we have achieved a lot, and inshallah, we will achieve more. Yeah.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think just launching from that example of the Constitution of Medina, the agreement of Medina, the actual wording used is really interesting, because the wording says it's a very intricate wording and an important wording. It says that, for example, the Jews of this tribe and the Muslims here are one ummah. They constitute one ummah. The phrasing here is really important, because the term ummah is very special to Muslims. And when most Muslims think of the word ummah, they think only of other Muslims. And here is the Prophet 1400 years ago using the word ummah to talk about Jewish people and Muslim people sitting together, being part of one polity, because that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to bring all of these different people, despite their backgrounds, into seeing them each other as equal, seeing each other as the same in political terms. And so I think that's what we need to do ourselves. We need to recreate that spirit. Now we have an added imperative in that we Muslims living in this country are 5% of, you know, of a country that is 95% not Muslim. And without being conscious of that, and not that we should be preoccupied with that or feel inferior, but without being cognizant of that reality, and recognizing that actually what we need to emphasize here is the common humanity, the shared citizenry that we have with our neighbors, starting on that footing. And the Sheikh mentioned, you know, faith and interfaith work, and actually I would say even beyond that, because sadly not everybody here in this country anymore affiliates with a faith or recognizes themselves as being following a faith. So I would say it's just on the basis of our human identity, we are in this together. We've been saying under this COVID stuff, we're all in this together and so on. But really we are in this together because you know, in a way the COVID scenario and the context hits home to us, how something like this virus doesn't differentiate between one person or another, between race or religion or background. So, you know, we really are in this together, and that's where we've got to start from in terms of community relationships.
We have a project here that's called Assessing the Effectiveness of Interfaith Initiatives. And one of the most important parts of interfaith initiatives is to ask controversial and difficult questions. And we have such a question here, and I think it's a question for Dilbar. An anonymous attendee has asked, many Shias commit bid'ah, which translates as innovation, heresy, and shirk, which is idolatry. How should we tolerate this? How would you respond to something like that, commentator?
Gosh, I have to be polite, so I will try to be. I mean, I think using words like that in itself is actually deeply problematic. Not that those words don't belong in our tradition; they are part of our tradition. But it's one thing when God uses a language, because God is, you know, omnipotent and all-knowing. But as human beings, we've got to be very, very careful about using judgmental words of others, particularly words like this that can have very negative connotations. And I wouldn't use these sorts of words to describe any other person, any, you know, and in, you know, in theory they could be used, and the people who do use such words will use such words towards many other Sunnis, not just the Shia, but towards other Sunni groups as well. They will say, because I don't have a beard, then I'm like this, or because I, you know, wear this, I'm like that, or because I pray like this, I'm like that, or whatever. So this attitude of being judgmental towards other people, as though we have become God and we are judging other human beings on the basis of their practice, you know, you can see it in medieval Christianity, you can see it in other religions, and unfortunately now we're seeing it very live in the House of Islam. And it's not good. It's not good. It doesn't do us any favors, and it doesn't help us at all move forwards in terms of these sorts of conversations. If anything, it takes us backwards. And I think we need to leave this sort of attitude and this approach behind. Let's focus, you know, in terms of judging, the only person I can judge is myself. Let me do that. Let me concern myself with myself, and leave other people to God. And I think that is a good starting point for these sorts of conversations.
Thank you, Dilbar. We are sort of coming to a close, and we cannot answer all the questions. Perhaps we can sort of stay on a little longer, and the speakers can maybe have a look at the questions and perhaps type some answers there. But we'll finish up with a question from Julian. He asks, is it all bad news? Reactions to the comments on the Twitter, you know, the Twitter controversy that we mentioned earlier, suggest everyday people are well equipped to offer ethical and moral commentary and guidance to their neighbors. What other positive signs of unity among Muslim communities have the speakers observed recently?
I mean, I think Julian is right. I think obviously because we're talking about certain issues, and we're therefore focusing and delving into some of the tension points and some of the conflicts and so on. But we are talking, we have to remind ourselves the broader context is that things are actually very positive. You know, if you look at what people are doing just in this month, Ramadan, people have been donating hundreds and thousands, if not millions of pounds to charities, to, you know, if you look at the Muslim community, it gives, I think, from the data disproportionately in terms of its numbers and its sort of socioeconomic background, very high amounts of donations to charitable works, people who are feeding poor and homeless people, and so on and so forth. There's so many things that are positive in our communities, so many things that are actually going right. And we do need to remind ourselves of those things, because actually, I am grateful for the question, because actually much of what's happening is positive. You know, people from generation to generation, we're seeing people. If you look at my parents came from rural parts of the Indian subcontinent, from Bangladesh in my case, with very little education. They came here just to make a life for themselves, just to have some basic modicum of a living standard that they could only dream of in Bangladesh. They came, they settled, they established themselves. In my generation, we went to schools and we went to university, the first of any of my family to ever go to university. And now in my children's generation, they're taking things further. This is a very, very positive development. And if we look at the macro picture, we can see all of these positive things that are going on in terms of the contributions that people are making, in terms of everyday people, as Julian has said, who are getting on with things, making their contributions in music, in baking, in politics, in the police force, in every sphere of life. Integration, if you want to call it that, but the acculturation, the settlement of Islam and Muslims is happening and is taking place. And that's all of that is to be celebrated.
Yeah. So maybe if I can add one or two words here, Dr. Miriam. I definitely agree with what Brother Delaware mentioned. Muslims continue to contribute their quota towards the development of the country. And majority of the Muslims in the country do appreciate the opportunities that the country presents to them. And they are proud of being here and to be part of the development. Even when you come to the front in regards to the relationship between the Shias and the Sunnis, good things are happening out there. Only few pockets of people here and there who want to, take advantage of the situation and cause mayhem and bring friction between the Shias and the Sunnis. Otherwise, if you look at, for instance, Muslim Council of Britain, for instance, we have Shias in the office bearers, and then you have the Sunnis, and they work together. They reach out to Shia scholars to contribute. They reach out to Sunni scholars to contribute. Somebody like me, for instance, I'm highly involved with the Citizens UK, and you've got Sunnis there, you've got Shias there. Of course, you've got people from other denominations also, but we meet together. We've got Citizens UK Muslim Leadership Forum, where I'm also involved. Maybe I'm among the few Shias who are there, but I'm welcomed, I'm cherished, I'm honored. My views are taken seriously. So yeah, so many positive things are happening. And I think if we are able to continue with such a dialogue, such a discussion, we'll be able to unlock the beauty out of the Muslim communities.
Emmanuel, would you like to do a final statement before I close up and we'll stop the live streaming on Facebook?
Yes, I want to, first of all, obviously, to thank everybody for attending. Thank you for the speakers. I think there's been very interesting, this is a huge topic, and I feel like we've already really scratched the surface of the tip of the iceberg of something that is a huge contemporary issue. I wanted to draw out a couple of themes and also perhaps add one of my own. I think a lot of the things that have been coming out is this need to contextualize Islam within the British context, the way in which Islam is changeable and can adapt to different circumstances, and that the internal diversity, I think often, especially as a non-Muslim reading the British media, there tends to be quite a one-dimensional view of Islam, but actually from the inside perspective, from the grassroots and the Muslims I speak to, there is a lot more internal diversity that's going on, but it's just not being represented. Obviously that is a problem, and we need more representation of this diversity, but the fact that the diversity is there and these conversations are happening, I think also, as Julian mentioned in the Q&A, the fact that there was a huge response to this guy pulling out of this funding campaign on the basis of this poor girl being Shia. The fact that normal everyday Muslims were able to respond and say, well, actually, this is morally wrong and also Islamically wrong, suggests that there is this diversity that's happening, there is this plurality of voices. But I also wanted to perhaps flag something that hadn't been addressed fully in the discussion and did come up in a couple of the questions, was that yes, I do think that there is a need to get away from this victim narrative when it comes to Muslims in Britain and Muslims in the West, but also we can't deny the very real social and political reality in that Muslims are being marginalized. You know, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Muslims are being discriminated against on the basis of their religion, that there's this sort of this racialization, the othering of Muslims that is happening. And yes, we need to be wary of turning that into a victim narrative, but we also need to combat the issue. I think also in the current situation, the current COVID crisis, the Muslim community has been disproportionately affected because they are disproportionately represented in frontline workers. So I think that's something that we do need to consider moving forward, and that's much more about Muslim and other relations rather than internal dynamic. I think what Dawa and Nuru have been focusing on is more the internal narratives, and I do definitely think we need to move away from this victim narrative, because people don't listen to a victim, and that's that's the horrible reality of it. But it's if you say, oh, I'm a victim and I'm oppressed, then people don't listen to you. So how can we find ways of creating a positive conversation, but also still addressing those structural issues? So I think that is something that needs to be developed in the future. But yes, so thank you to everybody, and thank you to Miriam. I will hand over now for you to wrap up.
Yes, thank you very much. So we'll stop with streaming live on Facebook very soon. I think we can stay behind afterwards, and while people log off, you could perhaps, the panelists and you can look at the rest of the Q&A, whether there's anything you would like to answer there. You can type the answers there, or if you want to respond in any way. But I think we'll finish the stream on Facebook now. Thank you all for coming. We had a wonderful audience, many questions. Again, I apologize to those of you whose questions we couldn't answer. Thank you to Emmanuel for putting it all together. Thank you very much to Dilba and Nuru for being such wonderful panelists. Thank you also to Tara, our communications officer, who facilitates all these webinars. Next week, we have a webinar planned with Dr. Ed Kessler, Lord Rowan Williams, and Baroness Varsi about sustaining communities during COVID-19. That's taking place on Friday. So if you are interested in that, please do come along. It would be very nice to see you again in the audience. And stay safe and keep well, everyone.